Hello, very beautiful community. In this chat, we're going to attempt a sort of a big picture analytical reaction to Zelensky's long form interview with Stuart Ramsey of Sky News. We're going to quote Zelensky fairly extensively, but this is going to be more an analysis than a recap of the speech. I might ask for 3 favors from you, which you don't have to give, but maybe you can try. Number one, try to have deep empathy for Ukraine's predicament. Number two, try to not have Disneyfied thoughts about Ukraine that are just based on warm slogans you encounter on social media. And the third is keep a hard-nosed focus on the West and the United States and European countries' national interests. So let's give this a go. But I mean, first, a couple of preamble thoughts matter. Who are we talking about when we're talking about Zelensky? And what you have to understand here is that great political leadership, just like destructive political leadership that's responsible for evil, is often a combination not of character alone, but of character secondarily, and then primarily contingent circumstances. So let's take the negative, destructive political example, right? If you have somebody like the war criminal Karadzic running a psychiatric hospital before he gets into politics, if he never gets into politics, and if, which is a big if, he was running the psychiatric hospital well, he has a completely different life outcome ethically, right? He became a disaster ethically by getting into politics. So, in the same way, political greatness can be an expression of character secondarily, and then primarily extraordinarily contingent political circumstances, right? So Zelensky offers a paradox of this kind to us. That's to say, if you pushed me against the wall and said, who's the greatest political leader of the 21st century, Zelensky might be the first name that comes to mind. And that's for two reasons. Because his leadership early on in the war was so crucial in a crucial war, and him staying was so crucial. And because that was made possible by a rapid degree of extraordinary personal growth by Zelensky. I mean, this is a man who went from low ownership to high ownership in a matter of days under extreme circumstances. Had he not been thrust into these circumstances, he would have remained in a situation where he was unpopular, where he was ungrounded as a political leader, where he wasn't necessarily trustworthy, and where even people who supported his campaign early on were often disenchanted with him. So it's both, right? And then years into the war, all of the less extraordinary dimensions of Zelensky can again be brought out by contingent circumstances. But either way, Zelensky in the opening stages of the war may well have done enough to be the greatest political leader in my books of the 21st century. But that's a paradox, right? It's not because we have some kind of ultimately grounded, immensely resourceful and wise and morally serious political genius there. We don't. We have a guy who, under very special circumstances, had a propensity to express some really utterly remarkable qualities. Now, let's ground ourselves on a second preamble point, which is really important. That's that I keep talking about us fighting, the West fighting a proxy war in Ukraine. And that's really important as a way of emphasizing Ukraine's agency. So most of the time, that term is used to deny Ukraine's agency, right? I use it for the opposite effect, to emphasize Ukraine's agency. So it's a kind of a pro-Ukraine and pro-supporting Ukraine use of that term. And the reason I insist on using it is because I think it's very useful to you. Because it centers for you the extraordinary difficulty of being in an existential political struggle as a nation that yet depends on the contingencies of domestic politics in the major capitals of the West. Right? That's an extraordinary difficult predicament because on the one hand, it's existential. On the other hand, it's not all up to you. So that kind of combination of dependence and existential risk is an incredibly difficult position in which to be. And we've got to have a lot of empathy for that. And that's the position in which Zelensky is still stuck. Let me then make another point from enough distance to make it okay, because I make an ethical distinction between how far I analyze Russia and how far I analyze Ukraine. And I tend to analyze Ukraine only in a very limited way at a distance, because there are marvelous experts to do that, who are not me. But it's clear that to a degree there is a simmering of a legitimacy crisis in Ukraine around discourse. And you all know that because you all feel that about your own politics, right? You all feel it when Kamala Harris in 2024 says something that could have worked quite well in 1994. What can be unburdened but by what has been? That's okay. It's kind of inspirational, aspirational. It's good. 1994. 2024, it's the empty words of a bureaucratic centrism that has lost touch with the nation, right? So that's the difference. At the beginning of the war, terms that Zelensky's administration, Zelensky himself, would use a lot, like in Ukrainian, like resilience, unbreakability, don't quite have the same conviction for a lot of Ukrainians as they did then. They sound more kitsch. They sound more Disneyfied. They sound like a kind of, box, put to cover up a reality that needs to be described more directly in other ways. So there is that sense of alienation about some of the heroic discourse from the government. It's worth bearing in mind. Let's begin quoting Zelensky, and I'll intercede a little bit with a bit of analysis. If we lose unity with the world, and so Zelensky's, this is not a translation, he's speaking in English, and that's why it's going to be a little bit jumbled, but he's a charismatic communicator, so I think it'll be clear enough for us. If we lose unity with the world, we will lose. But we aren't so close to that situation yet. And I'm going to stay 80% close to what Zelensky said, because sometimes he didn't finish sentences, so I'll simply round it off, but I won't change anything significant in his speech. On Trump, it's important that Trump and I communicate directly and that we don't allow affairs to be driven by other voices around the president. He said that we spoke very well with President Trump, but we didn't do details, and Putin needs details. And I also told Trump what I think Putin is and what I think Putin wants, and how important it is for all of us to understand that and not be delusional about it. NATO. Zelensky. We don't have alternative. We do not have an alternative to being in NATO. What's the alternative? Everybody thinks there is only one alternative. This is NATO. For today, maybe there is another alternative, but I never saw it. I never heard propositions about it. For today, I have security guarantees, bilateral guarantees. We did this already. But without a big umbrella, it doesn't work. We had Budapest. Doesn't work. Bilateral guarantees help us, but they don't stop Putin. We need something that will effectively stop Putin. Do you know what it is? I don't know, except NATO. I'm going to say quite a bit about what Zelensky is saying here and why he is saying it. But let's just put down one marker. NATO is not a realistic option for Ukraine. You can't rule it out because history is limitlessly contingent and extraordinary, but NATO is not a realistic option for Ukraine. However, it's my assessment that Western security guarantees for Ukraine are not a good to have, but they're a must have in some form. I don't believe simply ongoing Western support for Ukraine, whether it's led by the United States or Europe, is sufficient. I think Ukraine needs security guarantees for its medium-term political and economic sustenance, whatever form they take. I'm also at the same time saying that NATO is not realistic for Ukraine. Now, Stuart Ramsey asks, what if Ukraine joins NATO, but Russia keeps land? Zelensky says in response, nobody has offered us to be in NATO. But it's possible. No one has offered it, but it's possible. The invitation must be given to Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. You can't have an invitation to just one part of the country because you'll then recognize that Ukraine is only that territory and not the rest. We have no right to recognize the occupied territory. But in practice, we can concede land and then try to get it back diplomatically. So what do we think of that particular point Zelensky is making? I think roughly he is making a point that inevitably any Ukrainian leader has to make, and that is, yes, you can concede land, but you can never concede it de jure, you must concede it de facto. That's to say, you can never acknowledge that land as being legitimately Russian. Acknowledging that would threaten not just any Ukrainian government, but potentially the sustenance of the Ukrainian state, if the Ukrainian government tried to acknowledge that land as Russian. So that's a non-starter. But you can say, this is land that Russia controls, that's ours, but we will not try to go about reacquiring it by military means according to some kind of peace agreement. I'm going to mention this briefly, then we'll come back to it in more depth. Does Zelensky share my view that NATO is not realistic for Ukraine? Yes, he does. So why is he talking about it and how does it help Ukraine? It certainly has a galvanizing quality to talk about sustainable outcomes, even if they might not be realistic, on the one hand. On the other hand, it's also corrosive to talk about options to a population that half knows that they aren't real. That's a very difficult balance, and we'll come to what Zelensky might be criticized for and how he's striking it. Let me now address a quick criticism of myself here that is commonly made on the Ukraine skeptical part of Western discourse. And that is, you keep talking about Ukraine in NATO, and if it's Vlad, then you keep talking about not in NATO, but with Western security guarantees, okay. But you also keep talking about Putin challenging Article 5, potentially. Why are you such a hypocrite? Why are you trying to get Ukraine either into NATO or into Western security guarantees? But then you start saying Putin can challenge Article 5 in Estonia in 2029. That's a plausible possibility, not necessarily a likely possibility, but a very plausible possibility. If we watch your videos, that's what we assume, Vlad. So how do you square the two? Ukraine needs to join some kind of alliance or some kind of guarantee that is anyway not going to protect it because you say Putin's going to challenge Article 5. And the answer here is to accept the problem, right? You know, when I lived in Tonga, there was a boat that went from one island to another, and it was a 27-hour trip. And the boat listed very badly. And not long after I left the country, it sank, and 500,000 people lost their lives. Now, if I'm on land, I don't want to get on that boat. But if I am at risk of floating about in the ocean and I have an opportunity to get on a boat that might be listing and might be not that safe, of course I'm going to get onto it. So you accept the challenge that's being posed here, you accept the problem, but that doesn't mean that you can't order the preferences here very clearly, right? There is no doubt that the Baltic states in NATO are safer than Ukraine would be outside of any Western security guarantees. But that doesn't make them safe 100%. So that's the answer. Zelensky goes on. Everything comes late. Do they have more to give, for instance, of the Patriots? Yes, they do. Do they give? No, they don't. Why? I don't know. Lots of good decisions, but they're very, very late. And yes, we're sort of walking into a tragedy. Now, there are contingent military reasons for why some things haven't come on time that aren't directly political, sure. But here we run into the political challenge that the West supports Ukraine's survival without supporting Ukraine's victory. And the challenge continually for Ukraine has been, and this is what's actually going to excuse partly some of the criticisms we're going to make of Zelensky. The challenge has been that we have half spoken as though we're committed to Ukrainian victory, when we have only ever been committed to Ukraine's survival. Zelensky goes on. How do you want me to mobilize young guys from sort of 18 to mid-20s, when we don't know how they will fight, with what weapons? It would not be responsible for me to bring down the age. Westerners speak about mobilization, but the problem is we have brigades which are not properly equipped by the West. So I want to ask our partners to do their part of the job, and we will do our part of the job. Right? The tragic predicament of proxy war. On this particular issue, the recommendation I would make is just to be a bit slow. I've seen a few Western commentators saying, hey guys, if we're going to support you, lower the age. And I'm saying you are welcome to make that argument, but you should start by understanding the internal dynamics in the country. I mean, there is conflict in the country about this question, but there's also a deep sense of precarity about doing that touches on very sensitive demographic issues and issues that do in the end tie into Ukraine's sense of its own survival. So what I want to say is you're welcome to take a view on it, but don't just do that in virtue of some kind of logical jump. We support you, so you lower the age. You've got to look at what's going on inside the country and why this is actually a very complicated question. Zelensky concludes, more or less, we are in a war, and Europe is, I believe, already in a war, and now we have a chance, because a strong Ukraine can be a way for Europe to not be at war with the Russian Federation. Whether Putin dares to attack Europe depends on Ukraine. If Ukraine is forced into a peace, into an unsatisfactory peace, that'll give more strength to Putin and his belief in getting back NATO countries that were always under the control of the Soviet Union. And I won't comment on that in detail. Let me just make one remark that it's not so much that Putin has proprietorial attitude to all of Eastern Europe that sort of goes all the way down where it says it's ours. It's a kind of proprietorial attitude that says it's more ours than theirs. In other words, whether it's ours or not, let's debate, but it's certainly not American. So Putin's proprietorial attitude to Eastern Europe starts with the idea that whatever else is true, this is American empire extending itself into places that don't belong. Now, do these places belong to us? Well, maybe a bit more, yeah. So that's Putin's thought. There's no question that America has no business being there, and we might have some business being there. Now, let's analyze a bit more what Zelensky is doing here, because he is taking an important step, which he's been taking for a while, of saying, yes, we can concede territory, a step that wasn't being taken for a long chunk of the war. And there was a significant period when people in Zelensky's administration knew that they'd be conceding territory, but they weren't talking about it in public. Now Zelensky is in a phase where he's talking about it because it's inevitable, more or less. Nothing is inevitable. The Putin regime could collapse tomorrow, but that's not within the realm of likelihood. So he's made that step of moving on from talking about something as though it were possible when it no longer realistically is. And he's moving from that to talking about something else that isn't realistically possible as though it is. Why is he doing that? And what is going on here? He is trying to bridge a very big gap that's occurred in Ukraine's public discourse, Ukraine's conversation with itself, around having to move away from a conception of victory or conception of a good outcome in the war that is no longer available to another conception of victory or of a good outcome that makes sense but is not actually quite there. It's not clarified. There has not been an articulation of it. There has not been a kind of public engagement that could lead to an articulation of it. So he is working with that gap whereby you've moved on from one conception, but you don't have another to move into. And that's extraordinarily difficult. And he's doing this by incrementally moving from letting go one position that's unrealistic to sticking to another position that's unrealistic and then letting that go too. So the logic of that discourse by Zelensky is that he's going to let NATO go too, perhaps, and maybe then focus on something else that is not necessarily realistic or is questionably within the bounds of possibility. And that way, he's trying to bit by bit bridge that very, very big and scary gap without also coming out, with his political legacy in tatters. Coming out as not just unquestionably a politician of historical heroic stature early in the war, but also coming out, which is very difficult for him to do, and he is now quite unpopular in Ukraine again, but coming out also with a sort of self-image of somebody who is heroically been striving for the nearly ungettable for Ukraine in years 2 and 3, and may not have got everything ungettable, but may have got something ungettable for Ukraine through this kind of heroic aspirational struggle. And he hopes that that's a picture that could be sustainable if and when Ukraine is forced into a very painful compromise that might well put into question some of what Zelensky was doing and some of what Zelensky was saying in the second half of the war, right, in the year 2, year 3 of the war. So I think that's some of what he is engaging in. But we have to take considerable responsibility because we have spoken to him and we have spoken to Ukrainians as though we have a kind of commitment that we never had. We certainly had a strong commitment, but it was never a commitment to Ukraine's victory. So that's a little bit of a take on Zelensky's tactics and an ethical evaluation of Zelensky in the information environment. Lots of love.